thank you all for coming today. I know we've got 2 or 3 minutes. I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. My name is Jim Bish. I lived in this county for about 40 years. I'm originally from Nebraska. Came here after college, started teaching here in the mid-'80s. Taught here in Prince William County school system for 30 years, plus I worked with the school system in the summertime doing tours, history tours for new teachers for about 7 years after that. And as part of what I taught history. I taught at Woodbridge Senior High School for my entire career. And I taught local Northern Virginia, Prince William County history for over 20 years. So a lot of this comes from that time frame, because I just enjoyed getting out there. I helped start the Historic Prince William in 1989, now it's known as the Prince William County Historical Society. I was on the first group that started that back then. I served on the Historical Commission for a number of years. I've been involved in local history here a lot since the 80s. So, thank you, Mary. This is a book that I published in 2023. It's about George Washington, the anecdotes. You're going to hear about a lot of stuff in here today, but there's literally chapters and just so much information in here about Prince William County. It is full. In fact, there's 2 chapters just about Prince William County, all the people that are connected with Washington's life. Washington was extremely connected to Prince William County and people that were in Prince William County. It's pretty obvious. He grew up mostly in Fredericksburg, but he lived for 3 years up in Northern Virginia, what now is Mount Vernon, and his older half-brother ended up inheriting that property. So he was going between Mount Vernon and Fredericksburg all of his life. Literally, after the Revolutionary War, before the presidency, his mother still lived in Fredericksburg. He lived at Mount Vernon, and exactly the middle place between those two is Dumfries, Virginia. So he typically would come to Dumfries, stay overnight, be entertained by locals who he mostly knew, and then he'd go on to Fredericksburg and he'd do the same thing on his return trip. Not only did his mother live in Fredericksburg, but his sister Betty also lived there in the Kinmore house. So that's why he spent a lot of time in Prince William. He was related to many people in Prince William County. He just knew a lot of people. But this book has a lot. It was fortunate, won the National Book of the Year for the Sons of the American Revolution in 2023, which I was pretty proud of. Okay, we've got 2 Georges there. George was going to live here when this county didn't look like this. Many of you probably know that Prince William County formed from Stafford County in 1731. And when it formed from Stafford County, we were large. We included Prince William, Fairfax, Fauquier, and Loudoun counties were all part of Prince William County. And we were that way for 11 years before Fairfax County broke off with Loudoun and Fairfax. So George actually lived in this county for 3 years after they moved to what they call Little Hunting Creek Plantation, which is now Mount Vernon. He lived there for 3 years. So there's a lot of important stuff happened while he lived there. And of course, his father, Augustine, and his mother, Mary Ball Washington, they were very familiar. The Washington family owned a lot, and he owned all that property in Prince William County at that time. But I'm going to take you back a little bit that some of you may know, but others may not. This area was called the Northern Neck. Where we're at today was called the Northern Neck. Now, we think of the Northern Neck more of these lower counties, which are right here, which are Westmoreland, Richmond County, Lancaster, Northumberland County, those counties that you can see on the upper right-hand side. And the reason why we call that the Northern Neck is because the lower peninsula from the James River, here's Jamestown down here. This is the lower peninsula between the York River and the James River. And then between the York River and the Rappahannock River, we call that the Middle Peninsula. And then the upper peninsula, we call the Northern Neck. That's just how it kind of came about in the 1600s. And so the Northern Neck was a very different part of Virginia. We became an extension of the Northern Neck. And because of that, we had a lot of influential people and families that owned land in Prince William County that initially owned land in those counties in the lower Northern Neck. Now, the reason why they were so important was the guy on the left was King Charles I. And King Charles I, if you know anything about King Charles I, he had his body separated from his head. He was executed after the English Civil War of the late 1640s. And the supporters of him fled. Charles II, his son, fled to France. And while he was in France, he was still the King of England. This is when Cromwell comes in. And so all those supporters of King Charles I that lost in the English Civil War, many of them fled to Virginia to escape. And they were rewarded with large parcels of land. We're talking 10,000 plus acres of land. And what was happening in Virginia at the time was the lower peninsula and the middle peninsula had already pretty much been established and settled. So by the late 1640s into the 1650s and 1660s, the new settlement was in the Northern Neck area. And the Northern Neck area just happened to be one of the most fertile areas of Virginia at the time. And it still is. If you go to Westmoreland County, if you go down to where the Lee family, Stratford Hall, the Carters, the Washingtons, all that area down there, that is still prime farmland. And they just happened to come upon great farmland. They got huge grants from the crown, and they came with money. Unlike a lot of Virginians came here poor, they came with money. So they were a different class of people from the beginning, and we called them Cavaliers. Of course, University of Virginia mascot's a Cavalier. That's where that comes from. The Cavaliers changed America. I mean, these are the families that came in that supported Charles I. Washingtons, the Masons, Fairfaxes, Madisons, Monroes, Lees, Marshalls, Carters, Ewells, Balls, Taylors, Popes, Fitzhughs, McCartys. Some of the most important names in American history came about, and they got here in that regard. So the Washington family was one of those. Have any of you seen the movie Young Washington that's out now? Some of you have seen it. I'm going to interject that sometimes. Unfortunately, they didn't follow history real well in that movie, but they did follow. I think they did portray him, Washington's ambition and drive and character, and a lot of that came out of that. But this is what they totally got wrong, in my opinion, was Mary Ball Washington. They portrayed her as kind of somebody that wasn't very well educated. She lived in a poor-looking house, all of that. She was just the opposite. She was quite well educated. The reason George Washington turned out the way he turned out was because of this woman. She was a remarkable, independent, ambitious lady. She was born down here, down in this area of Lancaster County, Virginia. I think she was born at Maratico. And the reason for that is her father, Joseph Ball's first wife, passed away, and he started dating this other woman, Mary Johnson. He has a land transfer to his son about 2 years before Mary Ball is born. And in the land transfer, he's pretty much given his son much of everything, except he says, if the land, I'm going to be giving that to my wife if I should marry. And so he wasn't married yet. And he said, because I'm building a new house at Maratico. So I would think that new house was probably built within the 2 years that he married and Mary Ball was born. And to me, if you're building a new house, you're not going to just let it sit there. You're going to move into it when it's ready. And the other thing is that his son Joseph Jr. ends up getting that house. So that kind of became the primary house. Epping Forest, the house at Epping Forest certainly was his home, and it still stands. It's this house right here, in the upper one. It's there in Lancaster County. You can go visit. It was built in the around 1700, or excuse me, late 1680s. Maratico is still there. She grew up with a lot of relatives in this area. These are all real close to where she grew up. She attended a church there. The church she attended was St. Mary's White Chapel Church. It's the one to the far right here. It's still there as well. It's one thing nice about Virginia. So much of this stuff is still here. Here's White Chapel Church. It's been there since the late 1600s. This is where she attended church. She was very close to the Yule family, and her cousin, the James Ball family, literally lived within 2 miles of her. So they all attended the same church. So that was her connection. Her original immigrants that came over here ended up here, and that was the Millenbeck site. That's where the original Ball family came into. It was William Ball and then William Ball the first, and then it breaks down into William Ball and Joseph Ball were brothers. So Mary Ball, Washington, lived at B, and James Ball lived at D right in here. So they were very close together. And they became very close cousins. And I should say that Mary Ball, born around 1708, she was very close with Sarah Ball, who lived only a couple miles away, attended the same church, and she was about 3.5 years older than her. So they became very close. She was by far close to that family. Her father died when she was 2. Her mother remarried. Yeah.
Is the Whitechapel Church still a church, or is it?
Yes, it's still a church. It's an Episcopalian church today. And they have services a couple times a week. And many of the Ball family members are buried in the cemetery around the church today. Both William Ball, Joseph Ball, and James Ball, they're all buried in that church cemetery with their grave sites. The Ball family, after her father dies, her mother remarries a man by the name of Richard Hughes. Richard Hughes lived up in here in G, just north of there. It's about 35 miles. He was involved in a lot of court dealings. He was on the county court in Northumberland County and Westmoreland County. He lived right on the border. And her father knew of him from court dealings. So even though he lived a ways away, he was familiar within the family because of the court system. So her mother ends up remarrying Richard Hughes, but in Joseph Ball's will, he said that his wife could live at his home at Maratico as long as she lived, the family did, which was a much nicer home than what Mr. Hughes had. So most people, including me, believe that she probably continued to live at the home of the Ball family home down in Lancaster County, and Joseph or Richard Hughes probably also lived there with her, but he would commute and go back and forth. Now, when she's 11, her mother passes away, and at that point, she would have to leave her house, and her uncle Joseph ends up inheriting the property. But and at that point, her older half brother, who's also married, she remarries a man by the name of Samuel Bonham, and they move up here into the home. She inherits the home of Richard Hughes. So Mary goes up and lives with her as her half sister, which is now married. And that's kind of where Mary lives literally until she ends up married in Augusta, Washington. She's there. Her older half sister has a couple of children while she's there. She kind of just helps her sister. And she's there until Augustine. So that's after she marries Augustine, she will move to which is the Potomac Creek home of Augustine, Washington, or excuse me, the Pope's Creek home of Augustine, Washington. Now, flipping over to Augustine, Washington, his family had been around as well. John Washington was the first one that came here. He was a merchant his first time picking up tobacco and heading back to England. He ran aground at Pope's Creek, and lucky for him, he befriended the wealthiest guy along Pope's Creek, who the creek was named after, and he ends up marrying Nathaniel Pope's daughter, Anne. And for his wedding gift, he ended up getting about 2,000 acres of land from his father-in-law. So he was pretty much set up from the beginning. John Washington also had a brother, Lawrence, that came a little bit later and settled right here at Chotank, which is pretty close to where the 301 bridge is. If you go along 301 bridge from north of Fredericksburg, into Maryland, you'll go real close to that property. Now, the reason why I brought that up is George Washington's grandfather, Lawrence Washington, married Mildred Warner. He dies in 1698. You'll notice there, his birth is 1659. He was barely 40 years of age, 39 years of age when he passes away. And their three children, which were John, Augustine, and Mildred, they ended up going over to England. Their mother remarried, and they ended up going over to England for a few years. And it became a big court battle. A big court battle in that John Washington fought to get those kids back to Virginia. Lawrence Washington, who had died, in his will, he wanted his cousin to raise those kids. But his mother died, or their kid's mother died while they were over in England, and she was there. She died over in England. So the stepfather just continued to take care of the kids over there. Well, John Washington wanted them back. Who knows what would have happened if John Washington would have fought in the courts to get those three kids back. So he did get them back. They ended up growing up. George Washington's father grew up at Chotank. And of course, when he became of age, he was able to inherit the lands, some of the lands of his father, which included Maddox Creek and where Pope's Creek is. So he ended up inheriting that. Then he ends up marrying Jane Butler. And you'll see here, Augustine Washington marries first Jane Butler. They have 4 children. 2 survived, two boys. Lawrence Washington's the oldest. And then Gus Jr. is the other boy. Both of the 2 girls, or one boy, Butler, and another girl, Jane, both pass away before they become adults. Butler passes away before he's a year old. So those are the 2 surviving older brothers of George, half brothers of George. They were both over in England where they went to school, where their father had gone to school at Appleby's School in England. And now George, or Augustine, ends up meeting Mary Ball, and he has a second family. So you've got Butler and Jane, both deceased. Lawrence and Augustine are half brothers. And then George is the oldest one of 6 children with his mother, Mary Ball Washington. And there's a number of works that I just have 2 here, where it states how close Mary Ball was to the James Ball family, which lived next to her, and her family when she was growing up. And of course, George Eskridge, he was connected to both. He was connected to the Bonhams. Elizabeth Johnson, who was the half sister of Mary Ball, she was married to Samuel Bonham, and he was related to George Eskridge, as was Augustine Washington was the brother-in-law of George Eskridge. So he literally knew both of them, both families. And I'm sure after Augustine Washington's wife died, Eskridge said, well, there's this other eligible woman, part of the Ball family, and they ended up getting married. Most people believe that George Washington was named for George Eskridge, who lived at Sandy Creek. So here's where the Bonhams lived. Here's where Sandy Creek was, where the Eskridge lived, and over here is where the Washingtons, Augustine Washington, lived, all in Westmoreland County. Now, one thing that the movie did not even mention about George Washington was the ironworks. George Washington's father was well-to-do. They kind of all act like George Washington came from a middling family. He didn't. His father, at the time he passed, was quite wealthy. He was in the top 1% of Virginia's elite. He wasn't always there. When he got married, he inherited about 600 acres of land. He turned that 600 acres of land in the 1720s to over 10,000 acres of land by the 1740s when he died. And the big reason is because of this. He was deeply involved in ironworks. Ironworks allowed him to buy from his sister Mount Vernon, which was Little Hunting Creek Plantation. That was about 2,500 acres right there. He ended up expanding Pope's Creek Plantation. He bought Ferry Farm. He also bought 5 other significant parcels of land while he was alive. And the reason he could do that is because he had iron. He was the head of the Ironworks Accokeek Ironworks that's just south of us. If you go to Colonial Forge High School, that's literally about a half mile from where his ironworks is. It's a protected area along Accokeek Creek there in Stafford County, but that's where his ironworks, and he was doing quite well. He was monthly coming in income because of his ironworks. He was buying land, he was sending his 2 older boys to England to school. He was doing quite well. In fact, he was doing so well that he was setting up all these later plantations to be inherited by his sons so that they were set up quite well. So he wasn't a middling person. By the time he died, they put Mary in a terrible, like she's extremely poor. And in some ways, she is poor when he dies because Lawrence, the older son, gets the ironworks, which means all that monthly income from the iron is going to the oldest son. Lawrence also gets Little Hunting Creek, which the big most important plantation was Little Hunting Creek, which turns into Mount Vernon. So he gets that. The second oldest boy, Augustine Jr., gets Pope's Creek. So the 2 most important plantations that are producing well and the ironworks are going to the 2 oldest boys. So it did take a big hit compared to what they had money coming in after Augustine died. George was willed Ferry Farm, which is there in Fredericksburg. That was his holdings. And then the 3 younger boys were also willed properties, as well as some money put back for Betty when she married. These 3 families were involved in the ironworks together. You had Augustine Washington. He partnered up with his wife's niece, Constantia, who married Nathaniel Chapman. Nathaniel Chapman, he dies in Maryland. He was the wealthiest man in Maryland when he died. He had, if you look at these are all parts of their ironworks going clear up north of Baltimore, all the way down to Stafford County. And you can see the connections. Who was it that was partnering in those? You had Washington, Chapman, Ewells were in a couple, 3 of them. You know, they were there. And the other guy that I want to mention, because it's very important to Prince William County, is Charles Ewell. Sarah Ball was who Mary Ball grew up next to. They were first cousins once removed. And she marries Charles Ewell, who was another neighbor there in Lancaster County. So Sarah marries Charles Ewell. He's very involved in the ironworks. And Augustine and Nathaniel Chapman. They're all related through the Ball family. They're all connected to the Ball family. These are all cousins. And they grew up together. Now, when I say the Ewell family, have any of you heard of Bel Air Plantation in Prince William County? Charles Ewell built that. Charles Ewell started, he helped John Taylor start Neabsco Ironworks in Prince William County. He was the first guy to come up here to help Taylor start it. Charles Ewell also started the first ironworks in Occoquan, before it was Occoquan. John Ballandine takes it over. He's his stepbrother, and Ballandine builds the house there, Rockledge, which is in Occoquan. But all of that was Ewell property. Ewell came first, but the unfortunate thing for Charles Ewell, I don't know how he died. He was involved in the vestry of the church and all of that. But he dies in 1747, about the time that he's just taking off as far as leadership and money and all of that. And he dies very young. He dies, 30-some years old. So I don't know if it's an accident, appendicitis, we don't know. We just know that he died young according to court records. But one thing that's very important though, these kids are all growing up together. These guys are all involved in the iron industry together, and their kids, Jesse Ewell, Mary Ann Ewell, George Washington, the Chapmans, they're going to be together, that next generation, all through Northern Virginia. The Chapmans pretty much are all in present-day Fairfax County. The Washingtons are spread around from Stafford County north, and then of course the Ewells are primarily in this area. But they're all connected. They're all Ball family descendants. They knew each other extremely well at that time. And I should also say, everybody studies the Washington family, and they kind of put the Ball family to the side. For example, there is no Ball descendant books. Genealogy. You see, there's tons of stuff written about Washington family genealogy. The last genealogy written about the Ball family goes back 40 years, and it's not real strong. Now, of course, there are other sites you can find out information on now, but everybody just kind of dismisses the Ball family, and I don't know why. If you want to find out about George Washington, follow his mother's side. If your husband died and you have 5 kids under 11, are you going to depend more on your father's side of the family, or are you going to depend more on your side of the family? Common sense says she's probably going to follow on the Ball side of the family is who she's going to depend on more, which she did. And they were important. So many more Ball family members were involved in the House of Burgess as politically connected than the Washington family. These people that are circled here were all Ball family members that spent quite a while in the House of Burgesses. For example, Mary Ball's father, James Ball, he served in the House of Burgesses. You've got, Joseph Ball. You've got James Ball, her first cousin that she lived right next to. He was served in the House of Burgesses about 25 years. So, in the Washington family, you've got John and Lawrence. George's great-grandfather and grandfather served in the House of Burgesses for a short time. But the Ball family, there were multiple Ball family members constantly in the House of Burgesses all the time that Mary Washington was alive. From the time she was a baby up through her marriage to Augustine Washington, she had many House of Burgess members. Each county was able to select 2 House of Burgess members. By the time of the 1770s, we had 61 counties in Virginia, so the House of Burgesses was roughly 121 people. But they were the political elite of their counties. If you were in the House of Burgesses, her family was much more politically elite than Washington's, but you'd never know it. I went through about 25 Washington biographies over the years. Very little mention of the Ball family, but everybody was following the Washingtons back. It's just discrimination against his mother. I mean, it's just sad. Which benefits, if you really want to study Washington, go through the Ball side. George was born at Pope's Creek. It's in Westmoreland County. If you go to Pope's Creek today, you'll see the outline of the house that archaeologically they found 10, 15 years ago now. You'll see the outline. That's a pretty cool, because that's the original house. Unfortunately, in the 1932, we didn't have a house at Pope's Creek. It burned down in the 1780s, so everybody was trying to figure out where the house was. So they decided to put what they call the memorial house here. This is the memorial house in the background. It's there. Looks like a good old colonial home, brick home, but it's a little bit in the wrong place. Where that boundary is, that's the real boundary foundation for the home. What's cool about that is, especially today at the 250th, George Washington was born within those walls of that house, that foundation. That's where he entered the world. They lived there for 3 years. His father decided to move the family up to Little Hunting Creek. So George actually lived in Prince William County from 1735 to 37, towards the end of 37. So, and this is what Prince William County looked like when George lived here. This is how big we were. That was Prince William County when he was a little boy living in Prince William County at present-day Mount Vernon. And of course, this is what I explained to you earlier, how the county breaks up at different time periods. This is what Little Hunting Creek Plantation house looked like when he lived there. It's actually, Mount Vernon today is built around that house. It's been expanded outward and upward. But that's the base home, what it looked like when he lived there as a 3 to a 6-year-old. Then they moved to Fredericksburg, Ferry Farm, when he was 6. Now, the important thing that happened while he was a 3 to 6 is that the story about the cherry tree. And I know historians have done a pretty good job the last 150 years convincing everybody that the cherry tree was made up. But I'm here to tell you that the cherry tree story was not made up, that Weems gave us plenty of evidence to show who it was that did it. Now, again, historians have been trying to figure out who it was that did that, that might have given Weems, the author. Parson Weems was the author of the cherry tree story. He wrote the first biography of George Washington. Not only did the cherry tree event happen in Prince William County in 1737, but the story about George Washington and his entire biography written by Parson Weems was written in Prince William County in 1805. So both of those things happened in Prince William County. Now, in the book, but Weems writes that the cherry tree, another anecdote, was related to me 20 years ago by an aged lady who was a distant relative when a girl spent much time in the family. Then as Weems records the anecdotes, his eyewitness source refers to George as my cousin Washington and little George. George's father refers to the source as this good cousin of yours. So we know there was a source for this, and we also know that Weems got this about 20 years ago. Well, Weems wrote this in 1805, so if you look 20 years back, you're looking at about 1785 is where he learned of this story. So these are some things that Weems say about the anecdote, that the source was an older female and told the story 20 years earlier when Weems' book came out, so that would have been about 1785, 1786, Weems learned of it. Most likely related to, through on the Ball side of the family, as Weems married into the Ball and Ewell family. He marries Frances Fanny Ewell at Bel Air. That's why he ends up moving in 1795. He lived his entire last 30 years of his life in Prince William County. When a girl, this person spent much time in the family, was a girl in the fall of 1737, winter of 1738. Weems said that the event happened in the fall of 1737, so George Washington was born in February of 1732, so he would have been 5 years old. And she said that Weems writes that this girl took little George by the hand, which indicates that she was not a grown girl yet, but she is older than George, because he says little George. Was a girl but older than little George. George was 5, so she's probably between 8 to 10 years old somewhere. So all you literally have to do, which I did, is follow the genealogy. Who were they close to at the time? And who could possibly fit into that chronology? And of course, these were the close families to them. You've got Sarah Ball. These all grew up, as I mentioned. Sina and Sarah Ball were both daughters of James Ball, who lived right next to Mary Ball in Lancaster County. Sarah Ball, this other Sarah Ball, ended up marrying a McCarty down in Westmoreland County, and they move up here. What generally happened, people were moving and acquiring lands north on the Potomac River. The Washingtons did it. The Washingtons had Westmoreland, but John Washington acquired what is now Mount Vernon. The Carter family acquired much the northern part of Prince William County. The Lee family acquired Lee, Sylvania. They were all from Westmoreland County. So what happened, as lands came open, families, knowing that a generation, 2 of their families is going to expand and need newer virgin lands to grow tobacco on, they ended up platting lands north of the Potomac, which meant from Westmoreland County, Stafford, up into Prince William, up into Fairfax, present-day Fairfax County. That's just what happened. And so these families moved down from the lower northern neck. Sarah Ball married Charles Ewell down there. They were involved in the iron industry. They came up here to Prince William, Bel Air. Mary Ball and Augustine Washington, they moved from the lower northern neck. They came up to Little Hunting Creek, Mount Vernon. Dennis McCarty, Sarah Ball, she moves up. She marries Dennis McCarty down in Westmoreland County. They move up to Fairfax County, which eventually is Mount Air. It's a historic site in Fairfax County, pretty close to where Belvoir Army grounds are, the Army base. So those are people that were moving up here, and they were all connected from down there. Now, Sina Ball at the time, when you look at the dates, you go, okay, Sina. Sina's mother died in 1730. Sina was born in 1728, so she was a 2-year-old. In fact, her father, James Ball, had something like 7 children under the age of 12 when their mother died. And he does not remarry till 12 years later. And who does he marry? He marries his neighbor, who's a Ewell, Charles Ewell's mother. They get remarried, but that was 12 years. So 12 years from the age 2 to 14, Sina is orphaned with her father, raised them. Now, her father's in the House of Burgesses. He's a pretty important person in Lancaster County. So and you can tell, he is farming out, especially his younger children, to cousins. They're taking care of her for large periods of the time, which was quite common in those days, still probably is, something like that. So he ended up giving out, and of course, there were 2 of her cousins that lived up here together. Sarah Ball, who married Dennis McCarty, lived at Mount Air, which was only about 4 miles away from Mount Vernon, where Augustine Washington married Mary Ball, and they were living. So there was a couple of different time frames where little Sina was sent to live with her cousins for a while, and it was just in this time frame that all happened. In the fall of 1737, Sina would have been 9 years old, turning 10 in February 14, 1738, and George would have been 5 years old, turning 6 on February 22nd, 1738. So I know that everybody thinks that the cherry tree tale happened in Stafford County at Ferry Farm. It did not. Weems tells us the dates, so we know the dates that Washingtons lived there. It happened at Mount Vernon. Washington, on one of his later maps, he puts where the old orchard is, the old fruit orchard. It happened there, and it was there that all of this stuff happened. Now, Sina, later in life, she's going to tell Weems when she's at Mount Vernon. Anyway, after George is 7, he moves to Ferry Farm. So these are the views of George Washington's property. From 1 to 3, he lives at Pope's Creek. That's the view of Pope's Creek out to the Potomac River. Then, of course, Hunting Creek's Mount Vernon. That's the view of the Potomac River. And Ferry Farm, he lived right across the river from Fredericksburg. So you can imagine the commerce every day coming up the river, taking finished goods from England, delivering them, and then bringing tobacco and all of that down the river. That was his view every day, is watching commerce in addition to just, seeing what else was growing. So he had a pretty insightful view just from his bedroom windows in all 3 of his locations. While he was growing up in Stafford County, Prince William also made an impact on him. After his father died, the movie says that he didn't go to school after that. That's wrong. George Washington, after he was 11 years old, he attends a school run by Harry Williams in Westmoreland County for a while. He was staying with his older brother, Augustine Jr., for a year or 2. And he also attended Reverend Maury's school in Fredericksburg at the Anglican church there, St. George's Church, which is still there in Fredericksburg. Washington attended school there after he was a teenager as well. But Washington had an aptitude towards math. He was very good. A lot of his surviving Books are in the Library of Congress concerning his workbooks, math workbooks. And so he began to apply that towards surveying. At the age of 14, he starts doing some surveys, some practice surveys. By the time he's 16, his older brother, Lawrence, had befriended the Fairfax family. The Fairfax family was up at Belvoir, where Fort Belvoir is today. So Lawrence Washington marries the Fairfax's oldest daughter, Anne. So he's connected with the Fairfax family. Fairfax family is the wealthiest family of all the colonies. Tell you how wealthy Lord Fairfax was. He had 5.2 million acres of land granted to him. Everything between, and this one grand here, pull it back up, just this right here, that's all the land of the Fairfaxes. This entire part here, it goes out, everything between the Potomac River, which is the head in West Virginia, and the Rappahannock River, both sides of that was all Fairfax. To give you an idea how big that is, go 100 miles one way and go 100 miles square the other way, and that is roughly about 5 million square acres. Now, land isn't any good unless it's developed, sold, then you're making money on it. But just sitting out there, it's not that good for you. So Fairfax had a lot of people surveying it so they could sell off chunks of it. And Washington, at the age of 16, was invited on a expedition to do that by James Ginn, who was the Prince William County surveyor. So Washington really learns from one of the best surveyors in all of Virginia. And the following year, Washington becomes the youngest surveyor ever in the colonies. At 17 years old, he becomes the county surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia. This is the survey on the upper left-hand side. 2 years ago, I worked with a local surveyor that was kind of into history, so I teamed with him. I found the survey. It had enough descriptions on it that we were able to find George Washington's exact first survey. Now, the reason why it's a big deal is because the first survey is about 4,000 acres. It was along Flat Run, and if you look at all the branches of Flat Run, you're looking at about 15,000 acres. So trying to find 400 acres out of 15,000, historians just haven't looked for it. They knew where it generally was, but we found exactly where it was. We're putting up historical marker next year concerning that survey. This is the survey on the left. There's the area that it is now. If you go Weeping Willing Lane, now the reason why this is important, his very first public work when he was 17-year-old started here. This is point A on this survey. That's right here along this lane. He was getting first paid as a professional right there. His professional career never ended until he returned after 2 terms as President of the United States in 1797. So between 1749 and 1797, he was in the public arena the entire time. This began his work in a public arena. That's why that site's so important. Dr. Craik, just going to quickly go through Dr. Craik. Dr. Craik is not mentioned in Young Washington, and he should be. He was with Washington all the time. He was his closest friend. He was with Washington in the French and Indian War at Fort Necessity. He was on the Braddock campaign. He was the tent next to Washington throughout the Revolutionary War. Everything. This is him right here, Dr. Craik on the right, an image of him. He was by far, he was the first doctor called on Washington's deathbed in 1799 at Mount Vernon. Dr. Craik, they were just like this. They met in the French and Indian War, and after the French and Indian War is over with, he writes a letter to Washington. What should he do? Where should he go? And evidently, Washington told him to marry my cousin, because he ended up marrying Mary Amney Ewell up here at Bel Air Plantation in Prince William County. They got married in that plantation home. And then he moved across the river to Port Tobacco, Maryland. And they stayed there for about 20 years until the Revolutionary War came upon. And then George gave him the second best job of the Revolution as a doctor. The best job was working with the hospitals. But in that job, he couldn't be near Washington. And he told Washington, I want to have the job that's that I'm right next to you during the entire war. So he did. He took the second best job, and he and Washington were next to each other throughout. Now, Mary Amney's brother, Charles Ewell, was also in the Revolutionary War, local militia. He was very involved, elected here into the new government after 1776 in Virginia. But he was Mary Amney's brother, and of course his daughter was Fanny Frances Ewell, who marries Parson Weems, who writes the first biography of George Washington. And people say they aren't connected. It's like, you guys ever look at the genealogy and how these people are connected? The Ewells knew every story about George Washington. They were together in the iron industry when those kids were growing up. There was not a story that they didn't. They always were visiting Aunt Sida in Fairfax County. You know, they knew all the stories. So anybody that, you know, they're just crazy thinking that the Ewells and Weems didn't have his sources. But anyway, Weems comes into contact with Dr. Craik through Port Tobacco. Port Tobacco's in Maryland. He ends up going to school at a very wealthy plantation school in Port Tobacco. And these are all historical markers of the kids that Weems went to school with there. LaGrange is where Craik lived. Jennifer residence was over here at B. You have Richard Brown, Rose Hill, which is C. Richard Brown was one of the 3 doctors called at Washington's deathbed. Thomas Stone signed the Declaration, he's D. All these families were right there. They were all one of the most wealthy plantation schools in Maryland. And Weems came from a lot of wealth. Weems' family were merchants. They were merchants clear up into the 20th century. Weems was not poor. The whole Weems family was one of the most elite, wealthy families in Maryland. So much that he was taken care of. After he leaves the school, where he ends up going to school with Dr. Craik's children, they're about the same age, Weems ends up going over to England, gets a medical degree, and then gets a degree, theology degree, and comes back and starts preaching in Maryland. But on one of those trips, he asked his friend that he went to school with in Maryland to come over here and meet George Washington. In George Washington's diary of March 3rd, 1787, he writes, "The Reverend Mr. Weems and young Dr. Craik, who came here yesterday in the afternoon, left this about noon for Port Tobacco." So we know Weems visited Washington. Weems just constantly was asking about Washington. He had this, and I'm sure most Americans were at the time, you know, the guy that won the Revolution, all of that. But the night before, on March 1st to March 2nd, he stayed overnight at Mount Airy, McCarty's Mount Airy, when Sina was an older lady, and I'm sure that Sina told him a lot of anecdotes from her childhood staying with young George Washington, and one of those was a cherry tree. So I know exactly the foundation of Mount Airy is up there as a historic site in Fairfax County, and the date that Weems heard about that event that was taking place in Prince William County back in 1737. Weems, after he married, he ends up marrying, it's through that connection also with Dr. Craik, because Dr. Craik was married to Mary Amney Ewell, that they end up marrying, introduced to, and he ends up marrying Mary Amney and Dr. Craik's niece, Frances Ewell, who grew up here at Bel Air Plantation in Prince William County. And from there, he becomes a bookseller. He writes 4 biographies. He writes a biography about Benjamin Franklin, one about William Penn, and Washington. He's writing constantly and selling a lot of stuff. Dr. Craik, after the Revolutionary War, Washington convinces him to move back to Alexandria, so they're close to each other. He becomes the doctor for Mount Vernon. His townhouse is still there in Alexandria. About 60 feet away from that townhouse is where the Slade family lived. The Slade family ran a big merchant house in Alexandria. 3 of Parson Weems' children marry Slade children. that tells you how much they were visiting Dr. Craig and their aunt, Mary Amney Yule Craig, while they were there. You've got Jesse Yule Weems, Susan Weems marries Richard Slade, Charlotte Weems marries Henry Slade, and Mason Locke Weems Jr., who also turned into a doctor, married descendant Slade. So 3 children of a family that lives right next to Dr. Craig. Weems, the author, as I mentioned, wrote a lot of biographies, but Washington was over the charts. This is where I feel historians have done an injustice to Weems, because Weems should be recognized like Mark Twain. He was America's first biographer, first real American writer. Before the Revolution, we were reading British books. After the Revolution, we were reading Weems. He was the best-selling author, most wide-read author from 1800 to 1840 in America. Nobody sold or was written more. In 1850s, Alabama Congressman William Smith praised the work, and Abraham Lincoln confessed that way back in my childhood, the earliest days of me being able to read, I got a hold of a small book, Weems' Life of Washington. In 1996, Benjamin Franklin scholar Carla Mulford stated, although Weems was dead by the first quarter of the 19th century, that it was the most popular book on Franklin. Eugene H. O'Neill, in the early 20th century, said this about Weems, that he was the first important figure in 19th century biography, and Mason Locke Weems, better known as Parson Weems. There are many who will say that he's neither important nor a biographer. At the same time, he's one of the most remarkable and influential figures in American letters. Another literary observer said this about Weems: his style in many places approaches what is called prose run made, but every part of his book is rendered interesting by the peculiar genius of the writer. Very much should be recognized as one of the great literary men of American history. And because historians have just butchered him so much for no good reason, the 4 people that would have said something that those stories were untrue, including Dr. Craig, he lived to be 1814, George Washington and Martha Custis' grandchildren, George Custis and Eleanor Lewis, none of these people said anything in those books were wrong. It wasn't until the 1880s that historians started saying that Weems made it up, of course, after everybody's dead. It's just sad. I gave a talk at the Naval Academy conference on George Washington last year. It was a conference looking at George Washington's dilemmas and decisions, his most important dilemmas and decisions. And I started off the conference looking at the dilemma of the cherry tree, whether to tell the truth or lie, and then the decision George made. And I was working with somebody else, and we came to the conclusion that that's just how George was raised. Both his mother and father embraced John Locke. John Locke had put out a book on child rearing, and the book on child rearing says you don't discipline children, you praise them to get them to do the right thing. So they were carrying out what they were being taught at the time in colonial history. But anyway, but George Washington, just a quick thing here, and then I'll wrap it up. John Ballantyne was related to the Yules, and of course I kind of already told you about that. John Ballantyne worked closely with Washington on a number of entrepreneurial ideas. John Ballantyne was also married into the Blackburn family of Ripon Lodge. He married one of the daughters. He married a sister of Thomas Blackburn, who served with Washington in the Revolutionary War. Burgess Ball, another one of the Ball family members, gave Washington the first letter that his mother had died. He was a first cousin to Charles Yule in Prince William County. So the Balls constantly were closely connected. William Grayson, who was an aide-de-camp to Washington in the Revolutionary War. Of course, Bel Air Grayson tomb is in Woodbridge. After Sarah Ball's husband, Charles Yule, passes away, she married Benjamin Grayson. His wife had passed away. So William Grayson and Spence Grayson actually became stepbrothers to Jesse and Mary Amney Yule Craig. And Jesse Yule ended up inheriting Craig, of course, Dr. Craig's wife, Jesse Yule, inherited Bel Air Plantation. He lived there, he's buried there, he lived there in his entire life. William Grayson, Spence Grayson, who were buried in the tomb, they were their stepbrothers. And of course, Grayson, so much important. He was one of the first 2 U.S. senators from Virginia after the Constitution, was an aide, helped plan the trip across the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton. He was aide under Washington during that time period. He's just so much wrapped up into the important events of 250 years ago. Grayson County, Virginia, and Grayson County, Kentucky are named for him. Buried in Prince William County. Thomas Blackburn, Ripon Lodge, of course, connected with the family as well. Thomas Blackburn right here, Revolutionary War fame. His daughter, Julie Ann, married Bushrod Washington, the Supreme Court Justice, and she is buried at Mount Vernon. Bushrod ends up inheriting George Washington's Mount Vernon, and she was a maiden of honor at Mount Vernon, and then her niece, Jane Charlotte Blackburn, the circle of there, Mary John Augustine Washington, they also inherited Mount Vernon from Bushrod. So they lived there, and they're all buried at Mount Vernon. Connection with the Blackburns. And of course, the Henry Lee. This is Henry Lee of Leesylvania. Washington went with Henry Lee, rode to the House of Burgesses for 10 or 15 years. He'd usually come down to Henry Lee's plantation at Leesylvania, then they'd ride together to go to Williamsburg. Henry Lee was the head of all of the militias during the Revolutionary War in Virginia. And of course, it was his son, Light Horse Harry Lee, famous cavalry general during the Revolutionary War. George Washington saw him grow up from a little boy. You know, they knew each other just because of their dads being so close. And of course, he's the father of Robert E. Lee. And the Talos Ironworks here, they were always connected to the Washington family. They were all from Westmoreland County originally. One of the largest iron operations at the time of the Revolutionary War. Andrew Leach stayed overnight a few times at Mount Vernon. Andrew Leach, unfortunately, was the first Prince William County officer died and killed in the Revolutionary War. He was killed in the Battle of Harlem Heights. But we do have a park named after him, Andrew Leach Park, and there's a historical marker that tells about him there as well. If you go to Brooklyn, go to Columbia University, they have a marker on one of their buildings about Andrew Leach. Richard Graham, Washington stayed with him many times while he was in Dumfries. He was one of the wealthiest merchants in Dumfries. Cuthbert Bullitt, Portia Tebbs, these were all politicians that Washington knew extremely well from Dumfries. Captain Richard Francis Lee was killed in the Battle of Brandywine, again, through the Lee family, knew very well. Alexander Henderson, who the Henderson House is in Dumfries. Alexander Henderson served on the vestry, the Powhatan Creek vestry with George Washington for a number of years. They were close. He was one of the guys that also was getting supplies for the Continental Army from this area. Moves down to Dumfries, built Henderson House, which is still there in Dumfries. Washington went to court, ended up being on a jury for about 5 days at the court in Dumfries, where he stayed there. And of course, Gustavus Brown, Dumfries was one of the sites of where they were vaccinating smallpox. Everybody that was coming up from the south, the Carolinas, Virginia, they all had to be have smallpox vaccination here in Dumfries before they went on. Of course, the old Quantico Church is close to where the cemetery is today, Quantico Cemetery. Most of the Anglican cemeteries went under after the Revolutionary War because they were a separation of church and state, and many of them couldn't survive. And Washington mentions the track in Dumfries a lot while he was there for entertainments. Horse racing was big. So that's kind of a quick overview of a lot of this stuff, connections of George Washington and Prince William, which are many. Be very proud of George Washington because when you talk about leadership, people talk about Lincoln and Roosevelt and different other people. Nobody did what Washington did. Washington became the Continental General to lead the rough, ragtag, unorganized 13 colonies against the greatest empire the world had ever known, defeated that, came out, established America. And then when that nation started to fall, started to crumble a little bit, he helped organize the Mount Vernon Conference, which led to the Annapolis Conference in 1786, which led to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, which he presided over. He was the president of the Constitutional Convention, which passed the Constitution, and then when it came to selecting a president, he became the only unanimously elected president in American history. Served in that position twice. He gave up his military power, and he stepped away from the presidency on his own after 2 terms, establishing, getting away from a permanent executive. And he did all of that, created the presidency, did the impossible. Nobody had the leadership skills in the last 250 years that he did. He created a country, the first country in the world of democratic, of democracy and a democratic republic. And after that, over 140 countries have followed our lead, which he helped start. So he's just an amazing person to read about and understand. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.